Hi, I'm Grady Collane in the CapeCod.com News Center, and welcome to Sunday Journal. I'm joined today by a special guest, an expert on water quality. Do you mind introducing yourself for our listeners?
Sure. I'm Andrew Gottlieb, the Executive Director of the Association to Preserve Cape Cod.
All right, awesome. Now we're back in because, of course, we have the yearly report that you guys do. We wanted to start off with that, State of the Waters for the Cape and Islands region. Do you mind just giving us the broad strokes summary, and then we'll go from there?
Sure. So this is our 5th annual State of the Waters report. We started 5 years ago. 68% of our embayments failed to meet state and federal water quality standards. For the second year in a row, we're at 90% failure. Every south-facing embayment on Cape Cod, so everything that faces Nantucket Sound, all but one that face Buzzards Bay, fail to meet water quality standards, and we have a handful on the north side that still continue to exhibit good water quality. But we haven't seen much change in the numbers this year, and partly because there's not that many good water quality locations remaining to go bad. What we have seen is that in those that are degraded, that the expanse of the poor water quality has expanded, so that these systems die from the head down. In other words, the areas furthest away from the opening to Nantucket Sound, Buzzards Bay, or Cape Cod Bay, those areas, because they are subjected to less tidal exchange, high amounts of nitrogen coming in from development in the watershed, those areas furthest away from the opening degrade first, and then that spreads further down towards the openings. And what we've seen with increased loading, more people, more septic systems, more fertilizer, is that the areas of poor water quality have spread more broadly throughout these estuarine resources, leaving very little high-quality water in the estuaries at all. Even though the number hasn't changed, the conditions in each one of them has gotten somewhat worse. On the freshwater ponds, the numbers are pretty consistent. About 40% of the ponds that we monitor and have enough data on, in other words, about 150 of the 890 ponds, about 40% of those exhibit poor water quality at some point during the year, very often due to a cyanobacteria outbreak that results in a town issuing a recommendation for people to stay out of the water. Which ponds comprise that 40% varies a little bit year over year, which tells us that way more than that 40% that are exhibiting poor water quality are kind of on the cusp. And if, depending on local conditions, in particular heavy rain events that may occur at certain times of the year at different locations, those can trigger an outbreak of poor water quality in an otherwise marginal pond. So that variable is a little bit hard to nail down. And then lastly, on the drinking water, the story there is very much different. 19 of the 21 public water suppliers were rated as providing excellent water quality to their consumers. Only 2 were not excellent, and those were good, and they didn't have any health violations. So that's a good part of the story.
Well, that is positive. So we were easy find a drink, just maybe don't go for a dip, depending on when and where throughout the year. Yeah,
so we will, especially in the freshwater systems, we run at APCC a cyanobacteria monitoring program. We run a real-time map that people who are interested in taking that dip in the freshwater can go to see what the conditions are most recently monitored in a particular pond. So there's a lot people can do to educate themselves. On the marine side, it's really not so much a public health issue as it is an environmental decline and degradation.
And so, 90% is obviously very high. So that final 10% that's just where the tidal flow is going to be highest. Do you think it can go higher?
Yeah, 4 of those 5 that remain high water quality are on the north side, and north side embayments tend to have wider openings, allowing much more exchange of tidal flow. There tends to be a little bit less intensity of development on the north side, and the tidal range can be 10 to 12 feet, and that's a lot of flushing, whereas, Buzzards Bay and the south side, it's 2 to 3 feet of exchange and very narrow openings. So, the bay side has some of the better water quality remaining, but we're seeing indications, some of those larger systems, Barnstable Harbor being one, Wellfleet Harbor being another, big, wide open systems. Some of the upper reaches of those water bodies are also showing signs of decline, and it's all due to excess nutrients that come from poorly treated wastewater, as well as excess fertilization and stormwater.
So, I mean, you see the correlation between developed areas and where the water quality is worse is kind of what I'm gathering here.
Yeah, I mean, there's no question anymore what's driving these trends, both in the freshwater environment and the salt. It's too many nutrients, and nutrients come from two primary sources. The breakdown of human waste and septic systems introduces nutrients into the groundwater where it moves and finds its way to the nearest surface water feature, whether it's a stream, pond, or an estuary. And once there, it feeds algae that causes these systems to crash and exhibit poor water quality. The other major source beyond the septic waste is excess fertilizer. And the amount of fertilizer, nitrogen that gets put down on the land to promote the growth of turf grass, is a meaningful contributor. It's not the driver, but it is one of the things that in the short term that individual homeowners can do to lessen their contribution to water quality decline, which is just to lay off the fertilizers.
Lately, we've been seeing just a ton of rain. It's the kind of a rainy season for us, and we've been seeing more powerful storms as we're coming in with the effects of climate change. Do you think that is kind of a revealing force for how much we're impacting with fertilizer or even a runoff from boat ramps and stuff like that?
The climate change impacts as it relates to water quality are real, and they're now. A lot of people talk about climate change impacts in the future tense. There's two ways that what we're currently experiencing now contributes significantly to water quality declines. One is the world is warmer, water temperatures are warmer. And when you're trying to get plants to grow, you fertilize them and you put them in a greenhouse to warm them up. And we're treating our waterways effectively the same way. We're feeding them through septic and fertilizer runoff, and we're turning up the temperature. And so we're promoting conditions and encouraging conditions that give these algae species an advantage over other species in the water column, and they are taking advantage of that opportunity and growing to the extent that they cause these systems to collapse. The other way beyond temperature that climate is impacting our water resources now is the increased frequency of heavy rainfalls. These heavy rainfall events wash a lot of nutrient load off the nearshore properties into these water bodies, oftentimes during the summer, carrying whatever chemical fertilizers or pesticides or herbicides one might have had put on their lawn recently into the water bodies, either directly through runoff or down street drains and finding their way through conveyance into these water systems. So these heavy rainstorm events are one of the triggering events that we've observed as contributing significantly to the prevalence of cyanobacteria blooms in some of these freshwater systems. So, the threats are going to expand. There's also aspects of, impacts to our salt marshes due to sea level rise. Basically, our marshes are a very important source of nutrient attenuation. They provide great habitat. They provide buffers from storm surge, and marshes are designed by nature to rely on these flood and low tide cycles. And as sea level rises increase, or sea level increases, we're seeing inundation of these marshes in a way that's beginning to diminish their ability to function. So they're getting flooded out, and they won't serve the environmental service values that we've come to expect and need.
You remind me as well of the in Wellfleet. There's the Herring River Restoration Project. They're taking out a culvert, I believe, and they're going to be a sluice gate,
Right.
To update that for more tidal flow. Have you been following that? Is that an example of what you're talking about?
Well, yeah. So the Herring River Restoration Project is the biggest example of a series of projects that are being done not only on Cape Cod but elsewhere on the eastern seaboard, where historic errors that have disconnected areas of marsh that relied on salt water for tidal flow and flushing were limited by culverts being too small, sluice gates to control flooding and theoretically control mosquito populations, resulted in a lot of these salt systems turning over into freshwater marsh areas with species of the type that don't have a lot of ecological value. And so we've lost a lot of salt marsh. The project up in Wellfleet is removing that tidal restriction, restoring the historic flows, and will result in restoration of that historic marsh that's really been isolated from the Cape Cod Bay waters for over a century.
Mm-hmm. And of course, also this is, I believe this is the most expensive project of its kind in Massachusetts.
It's certainly the biggest of its kind.
Yeah. Is this, I mean, that's a lot of, I believe $30 million, I believe was the recent figure that had been offered up for the projects, I believe, at this rate. I mean, we're well over that at this point. But that is all money that probably could have been spent on other things. Do you think that this is just a lesson in, like, proactive thinking when it comes to how we design our infrastructure?
I think it's money well spent, in that, the restoration of that resource is going to improve flood storage, minimize flood damage for that portion of the Outer Cape. It's going to restore habitat. It'll support the shellfishing industry, provide nursery habitat for finfish and shellfish. So it's really an investment in the future of the fishing industry that is so important, particularly in Wellfleet around the shellfish industry. It's so important to the Outer Cape and so characteristic and emblematic of why people are on Cape Cod. So we at APCC are involved in a number of smaller marsh and river restoration projects to bring back habitat and to give these systems sort of a fighting chance to both survive and to continue to help us as people who are concerned about property damage that is coming from these storms.
Mm-hmm. But is it also like a lesson? Like, all of this has been caused by just one bridge and the associated gate. Do you think that, like, it's just like, it seems like such a small thing, and yet we've had this tremendous backup of water for, as you mentioned, a century?
Yeah, I think the lesson here is, to work our human infrastructure around the needs of the natural resources. So sure, it might have been cheaper in often case, there's a project in the town of Falmouth, the widening of the opening to Bourne's Pond. In the 1980s, they needed to put a new culvert in, bridge span across that opening. Well, it's cheaper to build a bridge span that was 25 feet wide than one that was 50 feet wide. The net result is they cut the tidal exchange by half. And by removing that flow restriction, the town is going to have a healthier resource, and it's going to avoid the need for significant expansion of their sewer infrastructure in the upper reaches of that water system. So by working with nature, nature provides a lot of what are known as ecological services that also benefit mankind's use of the resource. It behooves us to pay attention to how these systems were built, not try to redesign them.
Mm-hmm. And moving on as well to infrastructure, I wanted to ask you a little bit more about housing and development. Recently, I believe we're coming to a close, but the Cape Cod Commission has put out a housing development survey trying to solicit some review by the community in general. I wanted to ask you a little bit more about how the development over the past 30 years you think has gone, what your recommendations might be, and comments for them.
So it may seem odd to a lot of people that environmental organizations such as APCC is spending a lot of time on housing. There are a multitude of reasons for that. One is we're an employer just like everybody else, and we have staff, and our staff, much like The population at large across the Cape struggles with high cost of housing, and it makes it hard to find and retain employees. So we get that part of it. Secondly, we did a report last year called Hanging in the Balance, where we were able to identify that only 14% of the Cape's land mass is both unprotected and undeveloped. And what happens with that remaining 14%, 80% of which is state-defined critical habitat, is going to say a lot about what happens to the ecological and economic future of the region. And if you look at the type of housing that has characterized Cape Cod development throughout the development period, but certainly the last 50 years, what it's gotten us is fragmented landscape, degraded habitat, lousy water quality, traffic, and an unaffordable housing stock that doesn't serve the needs of the year-round population that chooses to make Cape Cod its home. So we look at this situation and say, if that's how developing what we've done to date has gotten us, why would a rational and sane community choose to develop the remaining land that it has in the same pattern? And the answer to us is pretty obvious. It's you don't. And we have worked with a partner organization, Housing Assistance Corporation, on something called Grow Smart Cape Cod, where we identified those portions of the Cape that are already developed, underdeveloped, or in need of some redoing, that when combined with wastewater infrastructure, provide the situation where you could begin to get the housing development that you need to meet the needs of the housing workforce without a lot of the ecological harms that have come from our existing development patterns. So our take on Cape Cod Commission's really good work on coming up with a regional housing strategy is that we have to lean even harder than they did in the draft on emphasizing that green space redevelopment or green space development is not the way to go for Cape Cod, that the needs of a diverse type of housing that's more affordable by definition of how it's built, getting away from the single-family detached home on an acre of land, that's not affordable. And there is no mechanism out there by which the market forces that have driven the cost beyond the means of a typical person to be able to afford it can ever be satiated by new development and leave the Cape a place like anything you'd want to be at. So our focus and our comments to the Cape Cod Commission is to put even greater emphasis on concentrating development in already disturbed and underdeveloped areas, pair that with wastewater infrastructure, abandon the notion that the region can build its way out of the housing crisis that we find ourselves in. And in part to do that, we ought to have an aggressive effort to buy down affordability through deed restriction in existing dwellings that are underutilized because they're only occupied 2-3 months of the year, and find some financial mechanisms to get those back into the year-round market. Utilizing the buildings that we already have has very little, if any, environmental impact. It's cheaper to buy affordability-based deed restrictions on existing houses than it is to build from new construction. And given how challenging the financial landscape is, we feel very strongly that explicitly acknowledging that we cannot retain the character of Cape Cod, retain the environmental quality of Cape Cod, and simultaneously try and build enough units to flood the market such that prices go down, that's not going to happen. And so, half measures don't get you anything. We need to lean into a new kind of strategy, and that's what we've encouraged the Commission to do.
Now, I mean, there's a lot of solutions that have been proposed to kind of help deal with the affordable housing crisis. I mean, we could also, there's whole structures like apartment complexes that might be kind of more what you're.
Sure.
Yeah, but what about like ADUs? We're seeing a lot of people talk about accessory dwelling units at various town meetings. Is that just another half step to you, or do you think that's a solution?
I think it's, I think there are certainly situations where ADUs make, a good deal of sense. You're not going to ADU your way out of this either. So I think that it's, one of many tools. And I think ADUs become, frankly, even more attractive when you're looking at, buying deed-restricted affordability into existing units. If you want to enhance that with an ADU, that's great. But I think, things like apartment buildings in already developed areas or underdeveloped areas, commercial areas that may have seen better days and are ready to be rehabilitated, again, when paired with wastewater infrastructure, absolutely. We have enough single-family detached dwellings on Cape Cod, and a housing strategy that's reliant on more than them is just going to exacerbate the problems that we already know we've got, and is not an answer. And it's not what the Commission's proposing, but there are plenty of people out there who are using the concern about lack of affordability as a Trojan horse to just build everything everywhere, and we know that's not the answer.
Now, as well, shifting a little bit away from the Commission and the survey specifically, just to kind of emphasize that this is not what they're recommending necessarily, but we are seeing a push towards mixed-use development, especially within Hyannis. They've been changing bylaws and re-examining. Is mixed use, do you think that's going to be the way to go? I have a quote from you from a long while back saying that we have, as a Cape Cod, acquainted ourselves to death, essentially. Right. Do you think that atmosphere is just a cultural issue? We had Mashpee Commons as well had recommended trying to expand a bit, especially with taller buildings, and it received a lot of pushback from the local community. A lot of it centered around character. Right. Do you want to respond to that? Elaborate more? I
mean, I think, done the right way, mixed use, dwellings over, first floor commercial, make a lot of sense. And, there's a segment of the population that, for whom, detached single-family housing doesn't work. It may not work for them economically. It may not work for them given, aging. And there's a lot to be said for, creating somewhat more vibrant locations where people have the opportunity to live around where they work and shop. There's a distinction and a difference between turning, every village center on Cape Cod into Somerville and doing more of what we're talking about. And so, I think it's all a matter of balance. I think that, it's easy to be for the broad concept, but against it in this particular location, and you get a lot of that. And you get a lot of it in housing, you get a lot of it in wind, you get a lot of it on everything. And at some point, something's got to go somewhere. And, there's something to be said for modest mixed-use applications in certain areas of the Cape.
Now, as well, we are currently experiencing a bit of a changeover in thinking related to Joint Base Cape Cod. We've had Mark Forrest, as well as the Barnstable County Commissioners in general, calling for a re-examination of the master plan related to Joint Base Cape Cod. As they are proposing an affordable housing area, it's raised questions about what is the best use of the land. Right. And I wanted to ask more, starting just with housing. Do you think there's a solution with the Joint Base? Do you have recommendations to the commissioners?
We do. APCC actually had recommended last year to the governor that new thorough analysis of the long-term military needs on the base and an assessment of how much property of the 22,000 acres that comprise Joint Base Cape Cod those ongoing activities would require, and that some real hard thought be given to alternative uses of the land not needed for military training as a way of taking a big bite out of the housing needs for the region. We're heartened by the fact that Mass Development, which is a quasi-public agency within state government, has been engaged to do a housing study on the base. We remain quite concerned that any kind of broad and legitimate consideration of the land uses on the property around, in the base, around the base, adjacent to the base, has to include meaningful public input from, at a minimum, the residents of the surrounding communities. We don't think that, as conceived to date, the scope of that project, because it's been solely reliant on leadership at Joint Base Cape Cod to characterize the interests, needs, and views of the surrounding communities, adequately accounts for what people care about on the base. And we've encouraged mass development to expand significantly who they're talking to include the people who are going to be most affected by what happens on that base, in order to come up with a plan that has any chance of obtaining broad-scale public support. But we think there's an opportunity to really think that through, meet the ongoing and continuing needs for military training, and achieve a public policy objective of enhanced protection of the water supply resources of the base, and deal with the housing issue.
Mm-hmm. Now, of course, as well, just as part of the Joint Base conversation, we do have that proposed machine gun range for Joint Base Cape Cod. Can I surmise that your recommendations would be very similar and more reach out necessary for local communities, or where are we recently with APCC?
Well, at this point, we are where we've been for almost a year, which is that the Environmental Protection Agency has issued a draft finding that the proposed machine gun range is a significant threat to the public water supply resources of the Upper Cape Water Supply Reserve, and that when finalized, that recommendation would preclude the spending of any additional federal funds on that facility. We agree with that finding. We're eagerly waiting for EPA to finalize it, but we, like everybody else, have no particular insight into the timing. We have been particularly concerned of late that, despite not having the permitting authority to build the facility, the Guard sought bids from the construction community to build it. And the bids they received, which we were able to get information on after filing a public records request, demonstrated that the two bids that were received of the project exceeded by almost 50% the amount of money Congress had appropriated for it. And this is now turning into, an uncontrolled cost project that would run to the public expense well beyond what was characterized originally. And we've been working with the congressional delegation to try and ensure that the project does not receive additional funds from Congress. We were successful in preventing an effort to appropriate additional funds for making it into the National Defense Reauthorization Act at the end of 2023, and we're watching very closely any and all other federal appropriations acts to make sure that the Guard doesn't slip something by.
All right, thank you for the latest update on that. You actually just reminded me as well, speaking of policymakers and legislators in general, it is an election year. And I also wanted to talk to you a little bit more maybe about the landscape so far. I'm not quite sure if there's any candidates that APCC has wanted to endorse yet, maybe a bit early for that, but how are you plugged into this? Are you hoping or maybe pleased or maybe displeased with some of the environmentalism seen in some of our standout candidates so far?
Well, what I'll say is two things. One is, as a 501c3, we're a non-political entity, mm-hmm. and so we don't endorse candidates and won't as an organization. We work with elected officials at the local, county, state, federal levels, and regardless of who ends up getting elected, we do our best to build a relationship with those folks. And look for common ground and doing things that are in the interest of the region. And ultimately, at the end of the day, I continue to have faith that most of the people get elected for the right reasons because they're trying to do the right thing. I will say, with the retirement from the legislature of Sarah Peake announced last week, and Senator Susan Moran several weeks prior from the Senate, Cape Cod is losing two thoughtful, articulate and effective legislators at the state level who have been in the middle of some of the more important successes we've had legislatively to bring the money that's needed to support the infrastructure development that will clean our water. So they've been great partners. We're going to miss them. Whoever ends up running for their seats, we'll work with them too.
Sounds good. Speaking of Susan Moran, who's departing from the role, she's also been integral in the ongoing conversation surrounding how Holtec International is handling the decommissioning process of Pilgrim Nuclear Power Station. Recently, you guys have enlisted potentially some legal teams to prepare for any kind of fight that might go on into how they take care of that. They had been proposing discharging it into Cape Cod Bay. Do you mind giving us a general update, especially as we've been finding out a lot of the water in question has been evaporating?
Sure. So APCC, had a significant concern about Holtec's plans announced in the later part of 2022 to discharge over 1 million gallons of radioactive wastewater into Cape Cod Bay. We engaged legal counsel, and we're not a litigious organization. It's not in our nature, but there are times when you need it, and this was one of those. So, and we did a lot of research and determined that, in our opinion, that the State Ocean Sanctuaries Act actually prohibited, as a plain letter reading of the law, the discharge of the industrial wastewater from Holtec decommissioning activities into Cape Cod Bay. We presented that legal analysis to Governor Healy's team, and they adopted that legal analysis in issuing a draft denial of Holtec's permit to discharge that wastewater. That draft denial by law had to go through a public comment process, and DEP is currently evaluating, to the best of my understanding, the comments it received prior to finalizing that denial. It is our expectation that they will finalize the denial. We don't yet have a handle on the time frame, and I will say that I was somewhat taken aback by Holtec's response. I expected them to do exactly what they did, which was to make a bunch of empty specious arguments about why, in fact, the Ocean Sanctuaries Act applies to everybody else but not to them. That's fine. I don't think that stands up, and their view won't prevail. So that we expected them to do that. What we didn't necessarily see coming was their move to, under the guise of creating a warm work environment for their decommissioning workers, that they were bringing heaters into the core reactor building, which, in addition to creating a nice, warm, cozy atmosphere for their workers, also increased the temperature sufficient that the 1 million gallons of wastewater that they want to dump into Cape Cod Bay will just sort of miraculously evaporate into the atmosphere and waft out of the building vents into Plymouth and surrounding environments, and Cape Cod, depending on which way the wind was blowing, such that while they continue to drag out the legal debate about whether their Ocean Sanctuaries Act denial was legal or not, therefore creating the appearance that the ocean discharge is their primary intended way of discharging, they'll just happily, merrily go about evaporating the water, and then when all the water's gone, they'll drop their appeal and they're done. And it was the cynicism of the evaporation option was somewhat stunning to us. We're continuing to work with state and local officials about what, if any, options there are to preclude them from continuing that activity, given the preemption and complicity of the Federal Nuclear Regulatory Commission in allowing these types of activities to go on. Our focus at APCC has been and will remain being preventing it from being an ocean outfall into Cape Cod Bay. But to say that, we're not somewhat taken aback at and unhappy about their plan to evaporate it under the guise of worker comfort would be an understatement.
All right, we look forward to seeing kind of how these things shape up in the coming months as well. So we're about coming up on time, but I did want to ask a little bit about how the prep for the summer goes, especially as we keep seeing these huge swells of population every year, as always. But will you be going back to the annual testing that you usually do, and can you tell people more about what resources are available?
So we're, winter's our quote-unquote quiet season, but we're awfully busy. So we'll be, we've already posted for summer internships, seasonal help, looking for people to go out and continue our cyanobacteria monitoring program in the freshwater, for a water quality technician to assist in our work doing monitoring of 50 ponds under contract with the Cape Cod Commission's Freshwater Initiative for standard water quality parameters. We're looking for people to work in our ecosystem restoration program to monitor wetlands, salt marshes during the growing season of the summer, and looking for somebody to manage our landscape consulting initiative, whereby we provide technical capabilities and expertise to homeowners who are looking to minimize the impact of their yard care practices on the ecology of the Cape. So if people are interested in that, we're hiring. They can find those postings at apcc.org. Look for employment opportunities, but we're anticipating a really busy and active summer in 2024.
All right, awesome. As well, actually, I had a couple last-minute questions about recent initiatives. I heard that there was going to be some potential satellite involvement soon. Is that for this year? Or
yes, that's been ongoing. We were working with partners, both the Cape Cod Commission, at NOAA, the federal agency, and EPA, where we're looking at using satellite imagery and the coloration of how water appears from the sky to link that to the water quality sampling we're doing, so that we can begin to understand when a given pond or a cluster of ponds look a certain way, it's indicative of the presence or absence of cyanobacteria, so that we can use the satellite that are passing overhead on a regular basis to give us a much broader coverage of what may be happening and where we ought to be sampling in order to provide highest levels of public awareness on potential threats well beyond what we can do with just feet on the ground. So that's been happening. We're continuing to refine that work this year. And one of the really cool parts of that project is it lets us, once we establish these relationships, to actually look back in time at historic imagery and get a sense of, has this problem been out there for a number of years, we just weren't looking for it, didn't understand it, didn't know what to look for, or is it actually getting worse? Because we get asked all the time, are things getting worse? And with any new monitoring program, it's hard to answer beyond the window that you open with when you start to look at the data.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's very interesting. I would love to see kind of where we can trace those data points back to. As well, I kind of wanted to have a quick kind of bonus question while you're here. We've been recently there's been some meetings about this. Falmouth has put up $80,000. I wanted to ask more about all the different infrastructure opportunities and tech going into water quality as of late. I've been hearing a lot about urine diversion. Mm-hmm. So while you were here, I just wanted to ask more about what is that tool's use in the ongoing conversation surrounding wastewater and trying to reduce nitrogen load on our local water bodies. Can you just kind of give us a few comments about what you've been seeing?
Sure. So I think that the use of the technology has some potentially limited benefit. It's the type of thing that, while you're waiting for the infrastructure to come to your particular house and you want to do something to minimize your impact on the water resource of concern, using urine diverting opportunities to keep that out of your septic system can make a difference. What I don't see it as is a basis upon which to stop or slow down municipal wastewater infrastructure expansion into areas that we know are having an impact. And I say that not because it doesn't necessarily work technologically, but you're getting pretty personal in terms of what you're asking people to do and changing their own personal behavior habits in a way that I've yet to see compelling data that enough of the population is willing to do it, that it warrants slowing down on the initiatives that we know and that are proven to achieve the kind of results that we need in order to reverse and then the decline of water quality and then obviously improve it.
All right. Thank you so much, Andrew, for answering all these questions. We covered a lot of topics, and I appreciate you making the time for us.
Happy to be here.
I'm Grady Collane, and this has been Sunday Journal.